Thank you for joining us around the fire. For more information or to make a donation, please visit randomactsnetwork.com. Now, want to hear a scary story?
I live in a medium-sized apartment in a medium-sized American city. It doesn't matter which one. You saw us in the last national election cycle under a Chiron reading, Heartland Debates Choices. My roommate moved out at the beginning of the COVID pandemic to bubble with her boyfriend. Luckily for me, my job picked up, so I never needed to replace her. When the company went remote, I turned her room into my office. I started jogging again when I realized I hadn't been outside for 10 days. There's a park by the river 10 minutes from my place. It's not big, but it's got decent paved trails. I go down mid-morning when regular people have to be at their desks or on their phones. Look, I know I'm not going to enter any marathons, but I need the exercise and I don't want people watching me. It's bad enough I have to watch my jiggle. Anyway, I listen to podcasts or music or whatever when I jog, though only with one headphone in because I'm not an idiot, thanks. A few weeks ago, I had to go for my run later than usual, in the early evening. I forget why, there was a deadline or something. It was the beginning of autumn, and the leaves were starting to come down. I was bobbing along to Lizzo when I saw an eye blinking at me from a log. I figured it was a skunk or a raccoon, so I gave it a half wave and kept bobbing. I do not mess with urban wildlife. I don't want a rabies shot. After a few days, I had to jog in the evening again, and I ran past the log. This time, 2 eyes and a paw, like a hand, returned my half wave. That got my attention. I've heard of pet raccoons getting set loose in city parks when they got too big. If one was abandoned here, I ought to tell the ASPCA or someone. It might even be something dangerous. A bunch of soccer players got surprised by a bear in another park a couple of years ago, and the city had to get wildlife control to shoot it with tranquilizer darts. I stopped to turn off the murder podcast. My fingers were sweaty, and by the time I got my phone unlocked, the log was empty. So I turned back on the story of the boxcar killer and jogged on. I had the boxcar killer in my left ear and nothing in my right. I'd been into the podcast before, but now I couldn't concentrate. The host sounded like someone talking on their phone in front of you in the supermarket line. I mean, the way they sounded before masking came in, obviously. You know what I mean, droning. I started to notice new sounds with my right ear, the one without a headphone. I'd never paid attention to noises in the park apart from what I need to avoid other joggers. Leaves shushing before they fell down, squirrels chirping, birds yelling at each other. I hadn't heard those sounds before. No matter how long I spent in the park, I always had something on distracting me. That day, I even stopped the boxcar killer to listen. My ear was still stuffed up, but there wasn't any noise coming in it. I was hearing in mono. It was pretty great. I felt like I was actually present in the park for the first time. I started noticing the different browns in the leaves, the way water stained the concrete of the path in some places, but not others, the wet wind off the river. Like I was there with my thoughts and not just my body. Then I got bored and turned the podcast back on. Nothing happened for a few days. I still passed the log, but nothing was ever there. I got into a podcast from 2 years ago about Bigfoot, and once I caught up on that, the algorithm linked me to a British series about cryptids. Really goofy first-hand stories about wailing white ladies and wild hunts and giant panthers. I guess over there a cougar counts as a cryptid. One of the episodes was about fairies. Since I'm not the kind of adult who thinks Tinkerbell looks good on my pajamas, I hadn't thought about fairies since I was a kid. I have to say, this dude in Cornwall or wherever hadn't seen anything you could market clothes with. According to him, fairies were weird little animals, not wish-granting ballerinas. What he said he saw playing in a spring of water on his farm were brown, humanoid creatures the size of a cat. They had scrubby, iridescent wings they used to leap up in the air like grasshoppers. They didn't wear cute green outfits, but they had a downy covering that might have been clothes or might have been fur. "Why do you call them fairies?" asked the podcast host in that calm, intimate, you-can-trust-me voice they use with the genuine crazies. "That's what they be," said the farmer. The host had obviously asked him to bring his best rural cosplay. "My old dad saw them many a time, and he taught me to know 'em. 'Son,' he said, 'don't you touch 'em or listen to their racket, and no harm will come.'" "Fairies, as we know, are oral or audio hunters," said the host. "They attract prey through subsonic frequencies." "Yep. You just keep the radio on in the tractor, and they can't get at you. Radio was broken that day." "Old stories say they have a preference for human victims. And have you seen them since, sir?" "One more time. Day I lost this finger, I was coming through the home copse not thinking of fairies or much else. Don't usually go that way at dusk. I was talking to a man on my phone about fixing a mower, and as I rang off I saw a little bright eye just peeping at me from the crutch of a tree. Thought it was a big squirrel. It made a funny sort of sighing, singing sound like a whimper, and I don't know why, I went to the tree to make sure it was all right. It was one of those little fairy creatures." "And it bit you?" "Tore my finger off at the root, sat there sucking the blood like an ice lolly. I had to have 6 stitches. "And you haven't seen them since?" "You'd best believe I haven't. I got my hands sewn up, and now I wear the headphones everywhere. Listen to the radio, like my dad said." "And you think the fairy you saw is part of a dying species?" "Must be dying. Can't lure us in with the sound the way they used to. Now we all have these damn machines in our ears. Audio armor plating. Stands to reason they're fading out in these parts. I haven't seen one since then." "Thank you. That's our pod for today, cryptidarians. Tune in next time for... My friend Nige says the machines eat our minds the way the fairies used to eat our flesh, but I reckon Nige spends too much time on that Reddit. Our in-depth dive into England's canals and the monsters that may... I don't live in Cornwall. I live in, like I said, a mid-sized American city. The park I jog in is a regular city park. Lots of trees I don't know the name of, concrete paths, water fountains with dog bowls chained to the bases. And as I ran past that log, I saw 2 eyes blinking at me. So I stopped and went up to it. The farmer was good at describing things. The creature shivering inside the log was about as big as a smallish cat. It had big eyes and a thin coat of downy brown fur. Honestly, it reminded me of a bat more than anything, except its face was, well, human. And it had pointy ears. That was all I saw before it bounded in the air. What I thought were spider webs were actually iridescent membranes connecting its wrists to its ankles. It jumped up on the log and towards the trees. I waited for a while, but it didn't come down. That night I did some looking around online, and the next evening I was ready for my little lost fairy. I didn't see it, and I couldn't hear anything even when I took out my earbud. I left the raw hamburger patty in the log and jogged on. The hamburger was gone the next day, and so was the new one I'd left the day after that. I started leaving the ground meat a little further outside of the log every day at dusk, and after about a week I hung around waiting to see if I could catch it eating. You have to remember, I didn't have anything to go home for. I mean, my job, yeah, but as long as I showed up on Slack at some point during the day and hit my numbers, nobody really cared about anything else. I'd quit using the earbuds at all by this point when I was inside the park. Just jogged into it and took them out. The weird thing was, I kind of noticed less about what was going on around me than before. I didn't even do my usual circuit of the paths. I ran to the log and sat on a bench near it, hoping to see the little fairy. Some evenings I'd catch a glimpse of it dragging the hamburger inside the log, squeaking to itself. After a while, it'd stop making sounds and I'd go straight home. I know the farmer on the podcast said fairies were dangerous carnivores. So did some people online, but so what? Any feral animal will bite if you provoke it. That English podcast made it sound like any wild creature bigger than a squirrel got treated as a potential murderer over there. I couldn't see how one little fairy could hurt me unless I lay down and let it bite me in the jugular, which I had every intention of not doing. Anyway, that's about the time I got mugged. Okay, I didn't get mugged, but it was close. I was sitting one evening on my bench waiting to see the little fairy. It was darker than usual because daylight saving time had just ended. The park has street lamps, but they're not great. I was watching the meat on the log, thinking of nothing in particular, and a guy sat down next to me. He had an N95 mask on, so I wasn't worried at first. Then I thought he was kind of close, even with a mask, so I moved along the bench. That's when he lunged at me, and I saw a box cutter in his hand. He started to say something, but do you know what? My little fairy jumped right in his face. It beat at his eyes with its weak little wings and screamed. Honestly, I don't know who was more surprised, me or the guy, but he ran away yelling, and my fairy and I looked at each other. It was the closest I'd ever been to it. Its fur, and I was positive by now it was fur, looked brown from a distance, but from a foot away, I saw it was brown and gold and gray, like a tortoiseshell cat. Its eyes were black. "Hi," I said, soothingly, like the host of the Cryptid podcast talking to that farmer. "You're a cute little thing. Do you like the meat I've been leaving?" Now, one thing the internet cannot agree on about fairies is if they can talk. I wasn't disappointed when this one didn't. It put its head on one side and shrilled at me. I chirped back. It edged a little closer to me, then spread its wings and hopped up into the tree the way it had when we first met. The next evening it was waiting for me on the log. It backed away when I flopped the hamburger patty out, but it let me watch it eat, which was a first. It was very dainty in the way it scooped little handfuls of raw beef up and nibbled them. I sat on the bench watching it, listening to its happy humming. Its fur was getting thicker and shinier, and it was putting on weight. I think it must have been starving when I first saw it. According to my cryptid podcast, fairies usually live in groups. This one was all on its own. And it was so gentle. Maybe someone had brought a tame one over from the UK as an exotic pet and it got loose. It certainly acted happy to see me after a few more evenings. It even let me crouch nearer to it while it ate. Poor little creature, part of a dying species. It couldn't hunt all by itself. It couldn't sing loud enough to lure in prey. I bet you see where this is going. I decided to bring it home. I did all the research. Got a lot of houseplants and did a Costco run for bulk raw meat, lined a shoebox with milkweed floss since I couldn't get thistledown, and every night it got a little darker a little earlier and I got to sit a little closer to my sweet little fairy. I had it all planned out. Once it would eat from my hand, I'd pop it into the shoebox and take it back to the apartment. It was getting colder and I was worried it would die if it snowed. The first day there was a hard frost, I went out with my box determined to bring it home, even if it wasn't completely tame yet. We could figure that out later. I knew it liked me and it liked the food I brought. The street lights were on along the path again. I hadn't been bothered by anyone since my little fairy scared off the mugger. I never saw anyone in the park these days, not that I was looking. Nearly getting robbed hadn't made as much of an impression on me as I'd have thought it would. My fairy seemed unusually pleased to see me. It fluttered right over to the bench when I sat down and started shrilling away the way it always did, like it was telling me about its day. I talked back, telling it about mine. It was so cute the way it clapped its little hands and smiled, and it really did smile like a person, not a dog or cat. Maybe the trilling was language, I remember thinking. Maybe it's trying to communicate. It was communicating, all right, just not with me. First thing I thought when I felt the pain in my neck was the man with the box cutter had come back. My fairy wasn't chittering the way it had when it scared him away, though, so I figured it was probably something else. I put my hand on the spot, and when I looked at it, the palm was red. I was bleeding fast from a deep bite in an artery. My fairy got more and more excited. It was laughing as the 5 other fairies swarmed over me and started tearing me up. They had waited a long time to get me away from my earbuds and off my guard. They were hungry. That's the thing about fairies. They aren't a dying species. They've evolved a new way to hunt. Out of Tune by Lydia Carr, read by Terri Lynne Hudson.